Good evening. Wow. Good evening. That's a little bit better. Okay. I was hoping he wasn't going to say Oren still introduces himself as Buzz Lightyear since he's, but yeah, he does. He says he's Buzz Lightyear. He comes in peace, so that's a good thing at that age. I really appreciate the invitation to be here. I know it was several months ago when I was contacted and asked about taking part in this. And every time I've been asked to come here, it's been a humbling thing. I know this congregation stands for the truth. I know the kinds of things that you do, your encouragement that you give to us is immeasurable. And I'm always been humbled by the invitation to be with you. You're good brethren, and we appreciate you. The brethren at Custer Road appreciate you, and the encouragement that, and knowing that the gospel is being spread is just something that cannot be described in words. So I could commend you in that and wish for you to continue in that work as you have been doing. If you want to open your Bibles to 1 Timothy 5, that's where we're going to be at tonight. While you're turning there, hopefully it's been something that you've read and been on your mind. I've had the opportunity and went back and looked at the different lessons that's been presented so far in this series, and they've been some really good lessons. And hopefully there have been some things that you've taken away from that to encourage you. Tim, when he was talking through chapter 3, mentioned the verse that talks about the way in which we conduct ourselves in the household of God. And indeed, I think that is a very good verse that encapsulates what Paul is writing Timothy about, is how he is to conduct himself and what the church is supposed to look like. When we get into chapter 5, there's some very practical things that are going to take place, and Timothy's going to be encouraged to continue the work that God has given him to do as we go through this particular chapter. When I think about this chapter, though, and trying to figure out, okay, so what is this chapter all about? One thing that was very evident as we go through it is that this chapter is a chapter that's about honor. And I think that this is a chapter that's very important for our day and time. If we had people who would treat others with more respect, to honor other people, and to conduct themselves in an honorable manner, then what a different world it would be indeed. And when Paul is telling Timothy, he's going to relate to him the way in which the church is to honor certain individuals. What's interesting about that, though, is when you go through this chapter, not all of it's going to actually feel like honor. It's going to be in the context of some things that may not necessarily make a person feel like they're being honored. They may actually feel like they're being confronted, and it may be offensive to them. However, this is an honorable thing that Paul is telling Timothy about. So in verse 3, you notice that 2 times in this chapter, in the New King James, that's the version that I'm reading from, there's 2 times he uses that specific word, honor. Verse 3, honor widows who are really widows. And then down in verse 17, let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor. But throughout this chapter, he's going to talk about this concept of honor and how important it is. And so what we're going to see tonight as we go through the lesson is there's going to be these first 2 verses where he's going to talk about reprimanding. There's rebuke that's in order, some correction that's in order with certain classes of individuals that's in the congregation. But you're supposed to do so because it's not just about what you say, but it's also about how you say it. And he's going to address that. Then in verses 3 through 16, he's going to talk about widows. And there's going to be a couple of different classes of widows that he's going to refer to. And in both of these instances, though, one is going to be taken under the charge of the church, which means taken upon the role or financially supported by the congregation. That's easy to see where that would be an honorable thing. But also, these younger widows are to be, and the word that's used there is refused, not taken care of by the church. But what we need to see is that is also an honorable thing. It's for their own good that happens. Then in verses 17 through 20, obviously as we saw from verse 17, he's going to talk about the eldership and his responsibility toward them and how they are to be treated with honor and respect. And then at the conclusion of verses 21 through 25, he's going to give Timothy, in the midst of this discussion about the elders really, he's going to give Timothy some advice about the way in which he is to live an honorable life. And so those are the things we're going to be looking at tonight. And what I really want us to be able to do is, as we go through this chapter, to be very much open to discussion. And so what we're going to look at the verses, and then I'm going to ask some questions. And then you're going to be able to basically teach the class. Because a lot of these things that we see in this chapter can be, there's a lot of controversy around some of them, but when you really go through the text, it's not really a complicated text. But there's some very profound lessons that we can gain from it. So let's begin. Verses 1 and 2, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, says, do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, with all purity. And so, how does Paul tell Timothy he is to address like the older men? Respectfully.
As if he were a father.
Right.
You.
Yes, your father, as if he were your father. He tells them, though, do not rebuke an older man, but instead you do what? Exhort him. Okay, rebuke means that you chastise, that you chide. The word literally means to beat upon with words. That's what a rebuke is. He says, don't do that to an older man. Instead, you encourage him, you uplift him, you encourage him to do the thing that he should know is right. Now, it is true that some people grow wiser as they grow older, and some people just grow older. Now, in chapter 4, he told Timothy that he's supposed to be able to rebuke with all authority, right? There's going to be a time when those things happen, but generally speaking, when Timothy is addressing an older man, do it with respect. Do it the way that you would if it was your own father, because that kind of respect is supposed to temper that kind of expression of reproof. What about the younger men? As brothers. I know how rough I treated my brother. Is that what he's telling them? I hope not either, because it's pretty rough. So what is he saying when he's talking about, as you would your brother? What's supposed to guide that?
Commonality.
Yes, a lot of commonality. And that's a word I want you to remember as we go through these other ones, because next he talks about older women. Older women as what? Your mother. If you're talking to your mother and you're trying to encourage her to do something that she does not want to do, or for her own good, how would you talk to her? A lot of respect, right? And there may be some sternness that's there, but there's a huge amount of concern that's there. And so then when he talks about the younger women as, and then he puts an addition onto that, with what? Purity, right? Why does he add that to there, you think? Yes, you're a man, and you're talking to a woman that's about your own age. You need to be careful about those situations. A lot of preachers, a lot of elders, a lot of just men in general have gotten in trouble by not having purity and not displaying purity, not making sure purity is beyond question in dealing with people of the opposite sex. And that is something that can be dangerous, so we have to be careful with that. And so what do you notice about all those words? Older men as fathers, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters. What's the word we use for that? Family. Right. That's the way that we're supposed to treat one another. That even when it comes to a rebuke, and rebukes are going to be in order, but when we address one another, even in the form of a rebuke, remember that we are family. What are we trying to accomplish? What is the purpose of the rebuke?
Get them headed in the right direction.
Right. And I want that because you're my family. You're my fathers, you're my brothers, my mothers, my sisters, and I want you to go to heaven. That's what I want more than anything else. That's what Timothy has been guided in this whole time in talking about the doctrine. That's why the doctrine is so important, because that is the thing that's going to get us there. If someone departs from that, they need to be brought back. So remember that when you're talking to people, it's not just what you say, but it's also about how you say it as well. And keep that in mind, especially when we're talking with brethren. Okay, any questions on that section or comments? All right, very good. Okay, so this next section, we'll probably have a little bit more, is honoring widows. And it kind of divides up into a couple of different sections. First, in verses 3 through 8, he's going to start talking about and give a little bit of a description about who is really to be considered a widow. So verses 3 through 8, it says this: honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command, that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So again, Paul is speaking to Timothy and telling him that this is the way in which the church is to deal with widows. And he introduces this idea of those who are widows indeed, or widows who are really widows. But before we get to exactly what that means, who has the responsibility of taking care of widows? Her family? Anyone else? The church? Who else? Us as individuals, right? When we go through the scriptures, you see that there's a tremendous amount of attention that's paid to taking care of widows. But not all widows are to be taken care of the same way. Here, Paul uses the expression in the New King James, really a widow. Some of your versions may say a widow indeed. And he starts talking about what some of the stipulations are that are attached to that. So what are some of the conditions? Especially this. What is the condition of a person who will not take care of a person of his own family? Worse than an infidel. What's going to happen to infidels? Cast into hell. You're more deserving of hell than an infidel if you won't take care of your own family. Why is that?
It's a natural order.
Natural order, right? If you won't take care of your own family, even people in the world will do that. They'll take care of their family, but you won't. Plus, what example do people of the world have that tells them that taking care of those who are in need is a good thing? But do we not have that example ourselves? Who is the ultimate example of giving and taking care of others? Jesus did, right? When Jesus was on the cross and he looks down from the cross, he sees John and his mother, and what does he say? Yeah, he puts her into the care of another person because he is concerned. He's drawing his last breaths on this earth, struggling to breathe out these words. But his words that he breathes out is about taking care of his mother to make sure she is watched after when he is gone. The Son of God did that. We have the example of Jesus Christ himself. We have no excuse. You know, we go through the scriptures and we see what the scriptures say about individuals. We see what it says about the churches. We see what it says about family members. We see all these things that's said there. And if we don't follow those commandments, we're worse than the unbeliever because we know what God expects. And we're just blatantly refusing to do it. Anybody else want to add to that? Any comments about that? Yes, sir.
You were causing me to think of Matthew 15,
Mm-hmm.
how Jesus would emphasize the Old Testament commandment of honoring father and mother, and how those Pharisees who claimed to be such strict adherents to the law just bypass that altogether, found a way to do it. And really the heart of the law was simply doing some basic things that God expected in our relationships with other people, including father and mother. It was a very serious thing that Jesus rebuked them for.
Yes, and also in Matthew 15, Jesus actually uses the word honor in talking about the parents and talking about financially taking care of them. Yes, one of the verses I wanted us to look at was that in Matthew 15, 4 through 6, where that very thing happens. And it's interesting that in that passage that, they were using something that sounded religious and righteous, a noble thing to get out of taking care of their parents. I can't take care of you, mom and dad, because, God needs his, and I got to give it to God, and so I can't take care of you. And Jesus said, you've made the whole law meaningless, has no power whatsoever now because of the tradition that you're keeping, that God never commanded. But he did command for you to take care of your parents, and that's the very thing that you're not doing. You see that heaven itself understands that when we're talking about a widow, and especially in these passages, the widow indeed is one who does not have family, no husband, and no children to take care of her. She is destitute, right? It goes on to say in this that there's piety that's to be shown to her. That means to show reverence toward any to whom such dutiful regard is due, that she is deserving of that. And then there's no one there that can do that for her in her family. That it even says that this is good and acceptable before God, that a person take care of their own family. That God sees such things and tells us that we should see it not just as being a privilege, but God even says that it's a condition of being acceptable to him. That God says, if you will not take care of your own family, why should I look upon you? Husbands, don't you remember in 1 Peter 3 and verse 7 when it says, if we don't dwell with our wife with understanding, what does it say about our prayers? Hinders them. Why should God listen to us if we're not going to dwell with our wife with understanding? Right? And here, it's the same thing. How can we ever say that we love the people in the world, that we love the stranger, that we love the lost, that we love anyone, if I cannot show love to my own family and taking care of them? You know, Paul gives some very strong directions here. But you see that even though it's real scathing, if somebody does not take care of his own family, they're worse than an unbeliever. That's pretty scathing. But do you see the honor that he's commending? Show piety, show honor to that family member that you have. But like we said, the widow who is the widow indeed is one who does not have such a thing. In verse 5 it says that she has her hope, this is basically what it means, that she has her hope settled permanently on God. And there's a widow that we read about in Luke chapter 2. Anybody remember her name? That she was in the temple for many, many years. She had only lived with a husband for a few years, and now she's an old lady, and she's been there for a long time. Anna, right? This is what we're talking about. This is what a widow indeed looks like. She has set her hope permanently on God. Verse 6 says that she's not somebody who's living for things like self-indulgences, that she's not demanding the dainty things of life. And Paul's going to talk about this kind of attitude again when you get into chapter 6 next week. And then he tells them in verse 6 that physically she is alive, but spiritually she's dead. Because the things that she's seeking after is the things of this world and not the things of God. But this widow indeed has set her hope permanently on God. Verse 7, that they may be blameless. And I think this is an important verse. Verse 7, that they may be blameless. I take that verse to be, it could be talking about the widows themselves or the family members themselves. I tend to think he's talking about the church. That in regard to these types of people, those who won't take care of their own family members, those who are in need of care, those who are the younger widows, those who are the older widows, widows indeed, that you need to do what's right regarding these people so that you can be blameless, so that they can be blameless. I read it that way because Paul is writing to Timothy and uses that. I could be completely mistaken in that, but that's just the way that I read that verse. Verse 8 says to provide for his own. You heard the word providence before? What does providence mean? What does it mean to provide? Right, to provide. Right. Is it?
God provides.
Right. Does he do it before we have a need or after we have a need? Yeah, most of the things when we're talking about providence is something that's provided beforehand. God does step in and provide for us whenever we do have a need and we go to him in prayer. He may answer that prayer in the affirmative and giving us what it is that we're asking for. But most of the time when we're talking about that word provide, it's talking about provide for in advance. So when do I need to be thinking about taking care of my parents?
Before they're old.
Right, before they get to that stage. You know, that's what it means. I need to be looking forward to that. So another reason why we work, another reason why we're wise to lay up stores for our children and our grandchildren is also because we may have to be taking care of our parents and our grandparents and such, because this lineage is not just the parents, but also could be grandparents or anyone else that's part of that household. And so we need to be looking forward to that day and knowing that we are going to be able to take care of them. Okay, anything else about those? Go ahead.
You know, in that section we're going to get to about qualifications for the church to provide, sometimes we don't want to let that kind of jade our judgment with regard to providing for those of our parents that were never Christians. There's not a criteria. They're saying that, well, they didn't handle their money right.
Right.
I mean, that's where Satan creeps in there, where we can try to make excuses for not providing for them.
Yes.
And so, you know, I just want to make that distinction here. My parents don't have to be Christians. They don't have to be righteous people.
Nope, not at all. There's no qualifications put on that. The qualification is this: they raised you. That's it. I mean, they gave you birth and they raised you. And that's something you can never repay them for. That's the kind of language that's being used here. They are deserving of these things because of that. And it's something that a lot of people don't think about or don't feel like they do have an obligation for that. Especially, I think in our society, it may breed that a little bit because we do have so many social systems that take care of it, and there may be some things that we don't have to do because of that, but it does not get us off the hook. Our parents need a lot more than just money, right? Yes, sir.
I guess miss not problems sometimes with a lot of this. I'm looking at it's not my job to figure out what's fair with do my parents deserve this, whatever. There are a ton of, especially in the world, even in the church, there are a ton of bad parents.
Yes.
And maybe in my worldly wisdom I can say they don't deserve this.
Right.
But that doesn't change the fact that just because maybe they did not honor me with, or whoever, with how they were supposed to do it, doesn't get me off the hook with now it's my turn to do what God wants me to do and show them honor in the way that should be done.
Right, absolutely. You're absolutely right in that. Yeah, the Bible talks about it when it comes to rulers as well. You know, there's a lot of rulers that are not deserving of much respect because of who they are, especially in this first century time period in which they were living, and yet they were still supposed to give honor to whom honor was due. And it's the same here with this situation as well. So again, Paul is calling to some very high standards, and they're very uncomfortable standards. But if we're going to talk about what real honor looks like, this is what's being described in these verses. Verses 9 and 10, along with verse 5 that we read a moment ago, starts talking about some of the qualifications of this widow who's going to be taken care of by the congregation. Verse 9, verse 5 again. Now she who is really a widow and left alone, remember she's destitute, she doesn't have anyone to take care of her or watch after her. She trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. Okay? Verse 9, do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. And so the question is simple. So what widows should be considered really widows? We saw verse 5. What are some of the other qualifications, like in verse 9? First one that's listed is what? 60 years old. Okay. Probably not a lot of explanation needs to be on that one. 60, right? Yes, sir.
This would be going to, these women would be fully supported by the congregation.
Right. Taking on the role, fully supported, same as the preacher and even some elders as well. There's not a lot of times you see these kinds of things happening in congregations. There's been very few in the time that I've been preaching that I've seen. I'd say less than a handful that I've seen these kinds of things exercised by congregations. Again, we do live in a slightly different time period. However, it does not negate our obligation to show honor toward these who are really widows. 60 years old is one of them. What's the next one? Wife of one man, right? I take that to be there was only one man that could have ever called her his wife. I know there's a lot of different views on that, and there's a sense in which all those things are true. It absolutely speaks of the principle of being devoted and faithful to one spouse. However, it says that she was the wife of one man. We at Custer Road take it to be, with the elders, one and only one. Same with the widow. However, we don't pass judgment on other congregations who choose differently, mainly because there is a sense in which it can be one husband at a time that's going through. You'd have to do your own research with that, and what the elders decide here is what's for this congregation. As I said, there's going to be a lot of controversies around that. You can do a lot of reading on that subject. You may walk away more confused than when you first walked into it. However, that's the way that I take the passage that's there. It says that she is well reported for good works. What does that mean? She has a good what? Reputation. Right, she has a reputation. People know her to be someone who is always about doing good. We had a lady in the congregation in Alabama when I was there, and she was a widow for many, many years. Even though she had gotten up in age, she was still able to get out and do things, drive. She had her own garden and all these types of things. On Mondays, she cooked all day long, because on Tuesday, she would pick up one or two of the other old ladies and would drive around taking meals to some of the other ladies that were shut in and couldn't get out. And people knew her for that. Not just in the church, but people outside in the world knew her for those things as well. She was well reported for good works and doing these things. Angie and the kids were out of town one time, and she knew I did not like okra. So she decided I was going to learn to like okra. And so she made okra 4 different ways. And there was no meat, there was no animal sacrifice on the table. I still do not like okra. However, she was trying very, very hard to show me some hospitality with something that she was able to do. And it's wonderful. You see those types of people in congregations, those types of women who are always about doing good and have that good reputation about them. In other words, she is living the kind of Christian life the Bible describes her to be living. Encourages her. Yes, sir.
Context that this is written in where it talks about the elders being worthy, especially the elders who teach. I think lends some credence to the idea that this is almost a job. That she's not just enrolled in terms of she's not eligible for Social Security from the church.
Right.
There's actually almost a job element to this. And I've even heard brethren wonder if early Roman Catholics didn't develop a nun system.
Right.
Kind of based on that idea.
Yeah, some of them, there are some who even say that it's eldress or a deaconess is what's being talked about here. I don't believe that's the case, obviously. However, you're right when it talks about, I don't see necessarily that she's going to stop doing these things. That these are things that she has been doing, but this is her life. This is what she does, right? And so she's being taken care of by the congregation, and she's going to continue to do these things because she's a Christian woman, if she has the ability. And I think some of the other qualifications we get to actually bear that point out as well. It says now that she has brought up children. What problem does that bring to the passage? Yeah, she's supposed to be without help, right? So how is it that this woman has brought up children and yet she's left alone with no one to take care of her?
The idea just narrows the pool from which you're getting that qualified person, and that those children would have to have passed away on their own.
Yep, that's one way. Some parents outlive their children, right? And it may be for these widows, it's that case. I think there's another case as well. Yep, maybe they deserted her, right? And I think that's probably why Paul is writing these instructions the way that he does, is because, as we'll see when we talk about the younger widows, these are things that are already taking place. They're not things that are theoretical. These are things that are happening that Paul's telling Timothy to take care of. So it could be that she's outlived her children or that they've deserted her. Lodge strangers, wash the saints' feet. I think both of these have this commonality to them. What's it pointing to? Hospitality, right? And humility, too. That she's willing to do these types of things for other people. She's relieved the afflicted. I think that speaks to what kind of soul she has, what kind of spirit she has. What kind of person is she then? Generous, compassionate, kind, sympathetic, right? Diligently follow. This is where I was mentioning a moment ago. Diligently follow every good work. In other words, she is a woman who is helping other people, both physically and spiritually. That's the kind of qualifications that are there for this woman who's the widow indeed. All right, let's move on to this next section. But what about now in the next few verses? Verses 11 through 15. But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house. And not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore, I desire that younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after Satan. Verse 16, if any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. So what about the younger widows? What does he say? Don't put them on the list. Refuse them. Why?
Well, it's a stark contrast from the other widow there, with respect to, I think, character, what they've been going after, they want to marry.
Yeah.
So they seem immature, spiritually not as mature either.
Right.
Age may be a factor as well.
Might be why they're 60 years old for the other ones, right? There's a little bit of a contrast there, though. He tells them, I desire the younger widows to marry, but right before that he says they grow wanton against Christ and want to marry. So is it good for them to get married or not? It's better, right?
There's something too with them in verse 12 renouncing their original pledge. So it sounds like maybe, I don't know if this has happened before, and then they've said, no, we've been supported by the church, and now we want to go back and get married. So there's something about maybe faithfulness there.
Yes, they grow wanton against Christ. The phrase in and of itself, when I was studying on this, is not necessarily that the phrase in and of itself right there is wrong. Because they're wanton, but it's causing them to be against Christ. But what they're wanting against, or wanting their own way with, insisting on one's way, is they're insisting on getting married. But Paul even recommends for them to get married later in this text. But if you're going to get married for the right reason. Don't just get married so you have somebody to take care of you. That's not the right reason to get married. Now, if you want to manage the house, raise children, if that's the reason you're getting married, wanting to get married, that's a good reason. But if the only reason you're wanting to get married is so that you have somebody to take care of you, so that you can be at leisure again, that is the wrong reason. And I believe that's what Paul is referring to here. It's much like in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 when he talks about, people shouldn't get married. Seems like he's saying. But, if you can't control your passions, then get married. It'd be better for you to marry than to burn. Yes, sir.
And in this case, they're younger widows. They've been married before.
Right.
So it's not someone who's chosen to be a virgin.
Right.
So they've already proven they need that camaraderie of their relationship at some point.
Yes, right. I knew a man, he was married for, I think, 46 or 48 years. He was served as an elder, good man, probably the best Bible student I've ever met in my life. He was just a really good man. His wife was a really good woman. I never knew her, but everybody, by all accounts, she was just a great woman. She passed away of cancer. He got married 12 weeks later. And you know those verses that talk about the continual dripping, or better to dwell in the wilderness? That's how he felt. He felt that way because he got married quickly. And it was one of those things that when I talked to him about that, I asked him, I said, why did you get married so quick? He said, I never knew of anything that was as great as being married until now. Now I know how bad it can be. And that was a sad thing. I felt horrible for him. If you're going to get married for the right reason. It can cause you to leave your first faith, your first love, as it were, your first initial pledge that you took to Christ, if you're not careful. These women, if they're taken care of by the church, the Bible talks about it being a bad thing for them because they begin to be busybodies. It's not honorable to take care of these younger widows. It is honorable to refuse them. Yes, sir.
You mentioned 1 Corinthians 7. It also talks about widows there that read.
It does. Right.
How many times I've seen that disregarded, and I scratch my head every time because it seems pretty black and white.
Yeah. We have a lot of reasons why we don't want to listen to what God says about stuff, even if it's just the advice verses. It's one of those things where it blows my mind. The thing about it is, think about this younger widow, what's said about her, and compare that to Proverbs 31, that woman. The woman in here, the younger widow, she's got so much time on her hands, she becomes a gossip, a busybody, so much time that she has the time to begin to speak things which she ought not. But the woman in Proverbs 31, she works with her hands. She gets up early to prepare food for her household. She conducts business, buying fields, works all night making merchandise, bringing them to market to sell. She makes clothes for her children and to give to those who are less fortunate. She watches over the way of her household, does not eat the bread of idleness. She fears the Lord. There's a huge difference between those two women. That's there. Paul would have women to be about working, busyness, about working. The verses that are used there that talk about idle, the word idle in that passage means inactive, unemployed, averse or unenthusiastic about labor. One of the definitions is not working the ground. Remember 2 Thessalonians 3 verses 10 and 11? If a man doesn't work, he doesn't what? Be a hard deal if we had to do that with some of our sisters. It's also been said that raising children as well. I was looking it up, and we know the divorce rate is really, really high, but there's a greater percentage of divorces that come from homes which have closed the door on having children for selfish reasons, because of career or whatever else it is, that when a woman chooses to not have a child, the divorce rate in that home is greater, because it's not the way God designed it. Pure and simple. That's why Paul tells them, that's what I desire for these younger widows. Marry, bear children, manage the house, which means be the queen of that house. Don't give the enemy an opportunity to speak reproachfully about you. And again, verse 15, some have already turned aside after Satan. Homes that don't have anything to eat, no warm clothes, nothing to help others, is a home that does not have a wife, that does not have a mom, that rules like a queen. That's Paul's instructions. If we want honorable homes, honor the role that's been given to us, because they are honorable indeed. All right, I think what time is that bell going to ring?
About 6 minutes or so.
Okay. All right, let's move on to the next passage. Verses 17 through 20. Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For Scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. Do not receive an accusation against an elder, except from 2 or 3 witnesses, that those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest may stand in fear. Now, he talks about some of these elders that are supposed to be considered worthy of double honor. This means that they are those who labor, and the word labor means to grow weary, tired, exhausted, to labor with wearisome effort, to toil. That word is an intensive word. And what it means is they labor in teaching, in doctrine. So they are the ones who are probably going to be preachers or also elders. That they're worthy of exceptional honor for what it is that they're going about doing. Elders can be preachers. Preachers can be elders. 1 Peter 5 and verse 1 and following, Peter was one of such. And it says that, and he uses that term, to not muzzle the ox that treads out the corn. And Paul had used this earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 when he talks about and uses the same expression, that preachers, that they're worthy of their wages. It's interesting that there are some people who don't think that preachers ought to be paid, that they ought to be kept at a minimal level, don't receive raises and things such as that, to keep up with the cost of living and those types of things. I dare any of us go to our own job and feel that way. He says it's cruel. If you've got an ox out there and he's treading the corn, it's right there and you won't let him eat from it, that's cruel. So why are you going to do that to the elders? Why are you going to do that to the preacher? That's not the way it's supposed to be. And he's telling Timothy this as the preacher. The preachers a lot of times don't want to be the ones who have to say, hey, the ox is kind of hungry. You don't want to have to be that. Congregations can be guilty of muzzling the ox. And when the ox is muzzled, you think the ox wants to work? Not much honor in that. Not much respect in that. And this is one of the ways that it's shown that he talks about here. Then he goes on to talk about accusations. And accusations against elders has to be and all accusations against elders. All of them. There's not some that are in a special case where you take one person's word for it. All accusations are to be handled with the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. Just like it is in Matthew 18 and other passages, this is a legal term to establish a fact that something has actually happened. And those witnesses, if they give firm testimony and it bears out that this elder has sinned, either in ignorance or in rebellion, he is to be chastised, rebuked, chided in front of the whole congregation for whose good? His and who else? And everyone else's. God does not tolerate sin even if it's from an elder. He doesn't tolerate it. Now, if that elder has sinned and he doesn't repent of that thing, he is to be rebuked in front of the whole congregation. And what's scary is that it seems like Paul is telling Timothy, and you do it, that the rest may stand in fear. That should be a terrifying thing to us, to know that even they can fall under the chastisement of the Lord as well. All right. Now, this last section, we have just a couple more minutes, I think. Living honorably and some personal instructions that he gives to Timothy. I charge you, therefore, before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels, those are your three witnesses, 2 or 3 witnesses, God, Jesus, and the angels, that you observe these things, all these things that he's been given charge of, without prejudice and do nothing with partiality. A preacher who shows prejudice or partiality does not need to be preaching, does not need to be teaching, has no business doing this kind of work. Don't lay hands on anyone hastily. Be careful about the person you give approval to. Don't share in other people's sins. Don't follow mob mentality. You measure everything by the truth. Keep yourself pure. Then he has to tell them, no longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. My brother here gave a great lesson about a year ago in this congregation about drinking. And brother, I appreciate it. I've had brethren who have told me that they have never heard that spoken from pulpits before and threatened to leave because we say that drinking is wrong. This verse, and I love the phrase that you used, using this verse to excuse social drinking is weak. That was good. I amen that watching it. We have no business doing it. The fact that he has to tell Timothy to take a little bit, and mix it with water for your stomach tells us that it's about medicinal use. Some man's sins are clearly evident, preceding them in the judgment. You're going to be able to see these things. It's going to be clear, preceding them the judgment. But those of some men follow later. You're not going to know it, but eventually they will bear fruit. And it may not be that fruit is known until the day of judgment. But as to the best of your ability, Timothy, be careful about approving of other people to be elders, to be leaders in the church, and about the example that you set. Likewise, the good works of some are clearly evident, and those that are otherwise cannot be hidden. And so there's many things that are in this chapter that talks about how Timothy is going to be able to keep himself pure. And most of it has to do with you have to see things objectively. And that is not always easy to do. Because at the beginning of this chapter, remember, we're supposed to be treating one another like family. So I love you as my brothers, my sisters, my mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles, crazy uncles, whatever they may be. But I can't let that get in the way of the truth. If it's the truth, that's what I've got to speak. That's what Ben has to speak. He has to speak the truth. That is his obligation. And he cannot let personal relationships get in the way of that. We have to be careful about how we say it. But brother, I think you agree with me. We have to say it. We have to preach it. We have to teach it. Okay? And so a few things as takeaways. That was the bell to dismiss, right? Oh, okay. I got 2 minutes. All right. So here's some takeaways. We need to show one another honor by speaking to one another like family. That's how we honor one another. We honor widows by taking care of them appropriately. Taking care of them appropriately also means that we do not take some under the role, because we can be a stumbling block that causes them to wander into sin. We honor elders when we give them proper recognition and respect. That means just because a rumor has circulated about one, and you might want to believe that rumor, you do not believe that unless there's been 2 or 3 witnesses. That means they have seen it, they know about it by some means. That is not a rumor. They know it to be true. That's the only time that we receive those things. And then lastly, we live honorably when we judge things based upon nothing more than the truth and the truth alone. That is always to be our standard. Again, it's not always going to be easy, but it is a huge task. And when we think about what the church is supposed to be, these are the things that we're supposed to help one another with. There's times where we do have to say things as elders or preachers that people don't like, and we know that. I usually tell people, look, you're not going to like what I got to say, but it has to be said. But always understand that when we do that, it's breaking our heart. It's breaking our heart. But I would rather say it and have you get mad, because at least your heart can still be touched, than to not say it and you be on your way to hell and I didn't do anything to prevent it. That's what we're supposed to be about. And that's why this chapter is so important when he starts giving these instructions to Timothy. It's going to continue in the chapter 6. Really look forward to what's coming this next chapter, because it begins to wrap all these things up. appreciate so much your time. If you got any questions about anything I said tonight, please let me know. I'll be glad to talk to you about those things.
Pray together. I'm grateful that you've allowed us to come together and study from your word and praise your name in song. God, we're thankful that you have revealed the way that we ought to behave in your house and how in your household. God, we're thankful that you have instructed us in how we ought to honor one another, treat one another as family, that we ought to care about each other's soul, that we ought to care about respecting one another. God, we thank you so much for the way that you have guided us. Thank you for the wisdom that you impart. God, we beg that you help us to employ these things that we've learned in our daily lives with each other here at this congregation, that we would honor each other and that we would treat each other the way that would honor you. God, ultimately it's your will that we want done in all things, and we thank you so much for that will. God, thank you for bringing Eddie our way, that he could share these things with us and lead us in this discussion. We're so grateful for him and his work. May that you bless him and the bread of the custard word. It's in Jesus' name we pray.